just to make an indication, the IT will assist us later, just to connect the presentation. But welcomed. This is our last session after lunch, and then as well as the session that will conclude the two-day network conference. And the last session of the conference, in any way, is the most exciting session. It is a very most exciting session. So this is a very much good contrast that after lunch, the last session, most exciting, unlike other sessions after lunch. So this one should generate excitement. Mr. Choud is here, and then ready to take us through. But I think just important note, just something to note, that all of us are aware that budget offices are staffed with economic finance and specialists in quite number of fields. So in the nature of many democracies, members of parliament are not expected to be specialists in these fields. The House Chair yesterday indicated that you get elected representative not knowing which area you're going to serve, which committee, and parties decides how they allocate members. So, and then we are required to perform oversight, and we've got to be smart in what we do, demonstrate that we understand what we are doing. So in this session, we're going to share, Mr. Choud is going to share with us the experience of how they tailor their products or analysis to effectively support the oversight functions of MPs. And it would also be ideal, quite a number of MPs are still here. It's quite good. Thank you very much, colleagues, to still be here. And it's ideal that we just benefit from this important session. And this discourse, the discussions here will help us to deepen our understanding, of course, as members. And the AG did apologize. He has an engagement. He just left now. And we still have a former Speaker of Parliament. So around lunch, maybe he will join us, Honorable Sisulu. Of course, he's a veteran of a liberation movement here. So Mr. Choud has been chairman of the Office of the Budget Responsibility since October 2010, having been reappointed for a second 5-year term in 2015. Previously, Mr. Choud served as director of Institute for Fiscal Studies from 2002 to 2010, as an advisor to senior management at the International Monetary Fund from 1999 to 2002. As economics editor of the Financial Times from 1995 to 1999, it's well-read Financial Times. And as an economics and business writer on the Independent and Independent on Sunday from 1990 to 1994. Mr. Choud is chair of Royal Statistical Society's Advisory Group on Public Data Literacy. He's also a member of the Finance Committee of the University of Cambridge and advisory committees of ESRC, Center for Macroeconomics, and the Oxford Institute of Economic Policy. He is also a governor of the National Institute of Economics and Social Research. Robert was educated at Queen's College, Cambridge, where he is now an honorary fellow, at the City University in London, and at School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He also has an honorary doctorate from the University of York. I have to read it full. He's the only one with me here. So I had a comfort, so thanks. And that allows me then to give over to Mr. Choud.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman, for that introduction and for your patience for reading through all of it, which was more than either of us deserve, I'm sure. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed once again for the invitation to come to the Prof and to his colleagues for their very warm welcome. And to you, Mr. Chairman, and to your colleagues. It's always an enormously useful opportunity to meet with your peers and learn so much from basically all the struggles that we've all been going through in slightly different ways in slightly different countries. But there's very clearly some common challenges and common opportunities for all of us, and it's wonderful to be a part of that. You're going to have to focus even harder because I'm going to... Sorry? Yeah. Fine, yes. The words may catch up with the voice in time, but don't worry if not. Just by way of introduction, I think I would say that it's obvious to say that effective communication of the analysis that all of us are producing at parliamentary budget offices and fiscal institutions is essential if that analysis is going to have an impact on policy and on the outcomes for good policy for all of our citizens. And in getting to that, sharing experience from your peers, from the way in which other people have approached this, is enormously useful. I think as public servants, generally speaking, we don't think that theft is a very good idea, but I'm a great believer in stealing good ideas from your colleagues around the world when they come up with, and these sorts of gatherings are a great opportunity to do that. That said, of course, as we've heard in a number of respects, in governance and management and analysis, one size does not fit all. These institutions, of which there are now, I think, about 40 around the world, of which Africa is obviously an important part of that, they do vary a lot from country to country because of different systems of government, the different problems they're designed to resolve, different capacities, etc. But as I say, there are common features to all of those. But obviously, what I have to say this afternoon is going to be coloured by the particular experience we've had in the United Kingdom with the Office for Budget Responsibility since 2010. So some of that will be more relevant, I'm sure, than other bits, but I hope some of it will be. I think if you're thinking about communication as an overall challenge, the sensible approach to take is going to depend on a number of different factors. One of which is the audiences that you're trying to reach. And I'll say a bit more about this because I think for most of us, although you may be immediately responsible or serving a particular committee or have a different function, all of us in effect have a number of different audiences, and you need to be alert to the fact that different people have different needs, interests, and understanding in dealing with the material that you produce. Secondly, of course, it depends on the nature of the analysis that you're communicating, what sort of job you've been given to do, and whether most of your time is explaining the impact of particular bits of legislation, whether you're producing regular forecasts of how the economy or the public finances are going to produce, whether you're producing sort of assessments of balance sheets or long-term projections. There are different bits of, different types of analysis, and those present different challenges. Another one, of course, will be differences in what you can and cannot publish. We heard this morning in one case a fiscal institution where you can't publish something until there's been approval more broadly from Parliament. That will be an issue for some people. For us, one issue is when we're trying to explain analysis that we do of what's going on in the tax system. There are restrictions because of the confidentiality of tax materials. So if we're writing a story about, or rather we're producing some material on the tax payments you get from banks, the problem is that there are a relatively small number of banks producing a very large proportion of the revenue, and therefore there's a limit to how much you can explain your forecast without breaching the confidentiality of those individual institutions. And so we basically have to make do with the information that the tax authority can give us, but they won't give us anything that identifies individuals. The other thing I think that the approach to communication will depend on, obviously, is resources. Different institutions are going to have different amounts of money, different technologies, different sets of skills in their employees to play with, and also different amounts of time. For some of us, you have to operate to a very short time horizon. And while you might love to produce 14, ideally tailored bits of communicated analysis for different audiences, if you've only got 24 hours in which to produce it, that presents some choices and trade-offs to be made. But I think the overall conclusion I would draw from the approach to communication is that transparency is enormously valuable. Transparency in terms of the analysis you do. Like children doing exams, we should be encouraged to show our working, Not just here's the answer, but to explain how you got there, because that will build trust. It may mean that by producing that detail, some people say, well, I don't agree with this or that particular part of your chain of thinking. But at the end of the day, it's a positive because people can see why you've reached the judgments that you have. They may disagree with you, but there's less chance that they'll assume it's just because it's politically convenient. It may just be a professional judgment with which they may disagree. The other thing I think to be transparent about is process. This, I think, does differ from office to office. We have a situation where before we produce our main publications, we have to have a period of private discussion with the Finance Ministry, with the Treasury. That naturally creates a suspicion that, you know, what you have produced will have been affected by that private discussion. And so the more transparent you can be about when we gave them the particular information, when we asked for some information back, when we gave them the final copy of the report, putting that all down clearly, again, helps to build trust. And if you get applause as well, that's even better from the sound of it. It's the sound of it, it sounds like you've got a round of applause there. Anyway, so let me say a little bit more now about the background to the UK OBR and, you know, what we're trying to do and therefore what we have to communicate. We were created back in 2010 to improve trust in official fiscal analysis. The UK, I think, by the standards of most countries, the executive is powerful relative to Parliament in budget policy, in taxation and public spending policy. And the Treasury or the Finance Ministry is powerful relative to the rest of the executive. So I think our structure and role reflects that, and we are designed more as a check on the Treasury, a way of keeping the Treasury honest, rather than a way of helping individual parliamentarians choose among policy options, although there's a common approach to some of that. We have a council of 3 people who are formally responsible for the decisions that we take, and 27 at the moment civil servant staff to help us with that. That, I think, coming to some of the governance discussions this morning, is quite a useful distinction, because I think it's very important that myself and the other 2 council members take the blame if the government or somebody else doesn't like the analysis, not the staff of the organisation, because it's absolutely key if you're going to get good quality people to come and work for you. They need to have fun while they're there, but they also need to see it as something that will make them a better developed person, a better developed public servant, that it will be something that enhances their career in the future, not something that blights their career in the future. So I think one of the things I'm paid for is to take the blame if people have an argument with what we produce. That's not something for the staff, and that the communication needs to make that clear. We've got 4 main tasks we've been given in legislation, one of which is to publish twice a year detailed forecasts for the public finances going 5 years ahead. So a forecast for every individual tax stream, different categories of spending. For example, debt interest, pension spending, social security spending. Spending on more broadly on public services we look at as one big envelope. We don't, unlike our Canadian colleagues, look at individual spending programs or projects, but look at it more broadly. We use those forecasts to judge progress against the government's targets. The government sets itself targets for how much it's going to borrow, how much debt it's going to have, and we need to explain to people whether our forecasts mean that they're on course to hit those targets, and if they're not, why not? And if they're only on course to hit them because they're doing something dodgy or slightly regrettable, then you need to explain that as well. So again, we use the communication and the transparency in that world. We scrutinize the cost or the revenue raised by individual spending measures. So this would be common with a lot of the work that PBOs are doing on individual pieces of legislation. So if there's a change in the income tax rates or rules, the Treasury will come up with an estimate of how much they think that's going to raise or cost. We will scrutinize that and say publicly whether we think it's right or not. The Treasury doesn't normally like to disagree with us publicly, so if we say we think the answer is different, they normally change their minds and come into line with us. Finally, we assess the long-term sustainability of the public finances, so not just a 5-year time horizon, but looking over 50 years. That is a much more rough and ready exercise, but allows you to bring in things like the fact that the population in the UK and in many countries is getting older, which means more people to pay pensions, fewer people working to pay them, and taking those issues into account. And looking at risks to the public finances. We've just produced, as somebody mentioned yesterday, our first report explicitly on the risks to fiscal sustainability and risks in the short-term forecast. One thing, so I think all of that, from the sound of it, makes us sound most similar to the Kenyan National Parliamentary Budget Office, but I may be wrong on that, but there sounded quite a lot of overlap in that in the African context. One thing we don't do is make policy recommendations. If the government is not on course to hit its target, it's not our job to say, well, they ought to do something to get back on it. That question is left for other people, for parliamentarians to answer. That's an issue for elected representatives. We just provide the analysis on which they can make those judgments for themselves. I think one thing which is useful, and again comes back to the capacity issue yesterday, with both our council and the broader numbers of staff, we think it's a positive benefit to have a mixture of people who've got internal experience from having worked in the Treasury or the Finance Ministry, the Statistics Agency, the Tax Authority, and a mixture of people who've come in completely from outside. I think it's a mistake, certainly when we're planning our staff, to go in one direction or the other. If you have everybody who's an insider, people think you're not independent and they don't trust what you have to say. If everybody is an outsider, you don't know the tricks that are being pulled. So having, somebody there or a few people there who know where the bodies have been buried, because they buried a few of them under previous governments or administrations, is quite useful. And as long as you have the balance, I think that's consistent with looking credible and independent to the outside world. In terms of the strategy and thinking about your overall approach to communication, I think a key lesson is try to know your audiences. Who are you talking to? What is it that they are interested in? And how knowledgeable are they about the material you're going to be talking to them about? As we heard a number of times in the sessions this morning, particular parliamentarians are covering an enormous amount of policy areas. Some will be specialists, they may be a member of a specialist committee, but you have to recognize that there's an enormous difference in the amount of interest and engagement people will have. I think most independent fiscal institutions have to address many audiences. So for us, we are obviously very interested in the communicating to the media, and there again you have some members of the media who cover these sorts of tax and spending and economic issues all the time, and then other people who don't cover it very often. And you have to be willing to help and to tailor your material to both of those. Among parliamentarians, there is, I think in the UK, I suspect more than in most countries, a big divide between a relatively knowledgeable small group of parliamentarians who are on the relevant specialist committee, and the Treasury Committee of the lower house, the House of Commons, is the one that we deal with most. But more broadly, and this is partly because Parliament is relatively weak in the UK context in tax and spending, there's very little engagement with us on a day-to-day basis. And I think one thing that we have failed to do so far over the 7 or so years I've been there is to think of effective ways to reach out beyond the people who already have a stake and an interest in getting to know our work well. And there are things that could be done about the parliamentary procedures in the UK as well that could help that. For example, Parliament debates the budget before any members of Parliament have been given enough time to read the documents that we've produced. So it's a pretty difficult starting point to begin with. On the specialist committees, which is obviously an issue that for parliamentary budget officers is important, I think a useful lesson we've learnt is that communication does not begin with having a report or a piece of analysis that you're sharing with that committee. An important thing to do is to build a relationship with that committee so that they know you, they understand the way you do your work before you even get to the point of presenting them with a particular piece of analysis. Now, there's an opportunity there in the UK. We had a general election in June of this year. So the membership of the Treasury Committee will now change. The new chair has been appointed. The rest of the members have not been appointed yet. But one thing we will do, which I've already arranged with the new chair, is to have an invitation to all the members of the committee to come in, and members of staff will talk them through the way in which we do the analysis, answer any general questions they have about the work that they've seen us doing so far, so that you get an opportunity to educate people, you know, in a quiet time when people have a chance to just look at this generally, rather than when you're sitting in front of the committee and being bombarded with questions about a particular piece of analysis and simultaneously having to explain to them what it is you do anyway as a broader institution. So I think investing that time in getting to know your stakeholders, your committees, you know, out of the heat of battle is a good idea. Other audiences, civil society, think tanks and pressure groups, academics, international institutions, all of those bodies are important in their own right, but they will express views on what you say, which will then be reflected back on the views that parliamentarians and the public have on you. So it's important to engage with those stakeholders, to educate and inform them, to keep them in touch with what you're doing, because that will return to your core effectiveness of helping Parliament or the public, whichever way you see that. All of these groups are going to differ widely, as I mentioned, both in their level of interest. You know, some people are deeply focused and delighted to read through budget documents. Others, frankly, don't want to spend any more than 10 minutes on it if they absolutely have to. There are different degrees of institutional knowledge. So, again, with parliamentarians, some will focus more than others. With journalists, some may be, you know, focused on that issue, or they may be political journalists and they just write about whatever happens to be the most controversial issue at the time. So, you know, like a lighthouse, the light may shine on you briefly, but then it moves off to somewhere else, and it could be a long time before it comes back again. Difference in the level of numeracy, their ability to deal with, you know, statistical information and to understand that, and differences in trust. Do these people instinctively think that you're a trustworthy organisation or not? And I think this is an interesting issue for newly created bodies. When we were created, the UK had no experience of an independent fiscal institution or parliamentary budget office. And I think it took 6 months to a year for the Treasury Committee to work out whether we were good guys or bad guys. They didn't know whether this was some cunning plan of the Treasury to just dodge the questioning and stick somebody else up there to deal with this, or whether we were actually there as something that would help get useful information out into the public domain. And I hope, you know, after a while, obviously, by doing the job, you prove that that's the case. But, you know, there is a bit of an education process to start with. So confronted with these very different audiences and very different sets of skills and understanding, I think a challenge for the material that you produce is, do you try to produce lots of different types of material suited to all these different audiences, or do you try to produce one product that satisfies as many people as possible, but with the knowledge that you're always going to disappoint the real cognoscenti at one end and the people who don't know, you know, one thing about this at the other? And obviously the amount of resources and the amount of time you have to deal with this task is an important determinant of which way you go. So in terms of the channels of communication that we operate with, and which I expect others operate with, we produce hard copy publications, books with the forecasts and the other reports in them. That, frankly, is a legacy of the fact that Parliament requires us to lay documents before Parliament, which means physically to give them a chunk of paper. I suspect if you were writing these rules to start with, that wouldn't be required and the whole lot would be electronic. But we're not in that world yet, so, you know, one of the constraints on us in producing analysis in a very short time horizon is that we have to meet printers' deadlines rather than just stick it all up on the internet and people can take it straight away. The website, I think, is our single most important mode of communication. A great value of it is that it's a repository, so it's somewhere where people can go back and see what you said about the same issue 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago over time. We put a lot of effort, not a great deal of money, but a lot of effort into the website as a useful tool for communication. We've deliberately kept it off the government, where the government has an overall sort of web operation called gov.uk. We're demonstrating our independence by making sure that we're not on that and we manage it ourselves, which is a bit more effort, but we think is worth it. There are press conferences we do when we produce the particular bits of analysis that the forecasts. So, for example, on the day of the budget, when the finance minister stands up in the House of Commons, delivers the budget speech, he sits down, and as soon as he sits down, we publish the forecasts that underpin the budget that he's just and he or she has just announced. And then we would have a press conference about 2 hours later, where people can come along. I will give a presentation, go through the main details, and people can ask questions. As I say, I think that works quite well for the press. It's not very helpful for Parliament because the MPs are already debating it while we're half a mile away explaining it to the press, whereas more obviously you'd have an opportunity to explain it to everybody and Parliament would wait a day and debate it later. But that's, I'm afraid that's a tradition hangs on a long time in the UK beyond its usefulness in this and in other areas. Parliamentary committees, obviously, we talk to at their request. Normally a hearing immediately after the main reports that we produce. We normally have there's a hearing with us, and then there's a hearing with the finance minister 2 or 3 days later. So a lot of the questions to us are basically providing the members of Parliament with ammunition that they can shoot at the finance minister when he turns up a couple of days later. So you're conscious in preparing for that, you know, it's not just you get a set of questions about what did you mean on page 38, but, you know, there is an attempt to get some ammunition there, and there's a political purpose behind this as well, which of course is fine. We do some formal and informal press interviews. We try not to sort of rush out and respond to every particular piece of economic information that comes out. There are other people around to do that, so we try to, you know, when we only say something when we've got something new and important to say, rather than just saying it for the sake of it, which I think has a value in communication because it means that people, you know, notice more when you do say something than if you're just constantly jabbering and responding to every piece of information that comes along. But again, there's a choice in terms of building your profile as to how you strike that balance. Blogs and social media are increasingly important. We use social media to inform people when we're producing material. We've decided not, though, to get into, you know, responding to people tweeting every day. That way we'd never get any work done properly, because there are, you know, communities of people who are interested in these issues are constantly blogging and tweeting. You'd never get any work done if you spent all your time going through and responding to every silly piece of message that comes across there. Right, well, at this stage, we now run into the more difficult bits where I would be showing you pictures, so I shall now have to explain them through words. And indeed, one of the messages I had was that pictures are very useful because they mean that you can say things without going through the words. So I'm now going to demonstrate how difficult it is to say it without the picture by trying to describe them. One of which is would just have been to say, on the basis of work that Sahir and colleagues did for their external review of the OBR, that the website is by far the most important channel of community. If you ask stakeholders where they get the information from, the website is vital, and so therefore I think it is definitely worth investing the time and effort in that. I would be showing you the homepage of the website, which what we've tried to do is design. It's not a very sophisticated, not a very elegant. We've not spent lots of money on flashy photographs or anything like that. The aim really is to provide a quick way into each of the main publications that we produce, but also explaining briefly what it is that each of those documents produce. So if we've got something called the Fiscal Sustainability Report, you know, it's good if somebody hovers their mouse over that for just having a paragraph that says what this is, rather than expecting people to know what the document is, even if there's, you know, the title is not straightforward. We use the website to have a briefing every month on the latest sets of public finance numbers that have come out. We use it as a calendar for when we're going to be releasing material in the future. That, I think, is quite important, so journalists know when something is coming, and the committee people will know when something is coming as well. It has to be said that I think the increasing use of the website is also something where the value of having younger members of staff is very good. For we oldsters, the technology is a bit baffling, and then you suddenly discover that you have a new member of staff who's just come out of university or is a student who can do all of this stuff at a third of the time that you thought it was possible. So it's like those medicine bottles that, it says only for 5-year-olds and over, and it's only the people under 5 who can open them. And the same, I think, is true with the website. So it's a good opportunity and virtue to have younger members of staff. One communication tool we found quite useful, which we've recently introduced on the website, which is not a terribly technologically sophisticated thing to do, although it did require a young member of staff to point out that you could do this, was when you do produce a presentation, is the ability to just film that presentation and then have a YouTube video which consists of basically me at one side of the screen going through the presentation, and then the slides automatically turning over in the rest of the picture, which is so for people who can't get to a press conference, who can't get to a presentation, they can actually go through that all simply online, and that's actually turned out to be quite useful. It does mean that fewer people turn up to your presentations, but hopefully more people get to them in the end. Let me say a little bit about the particular issues that surround communicating forecasts. So, as I say, we produce, looking 5 years ahead, a forecast of what government spending, government revenue, borrowing, debt is going to be on the basis of the government's current policy, dependent on how we think the economy is going to evolve. And communicating that presents a number of challenges, some of which are common to the looking at individual bits of legislation, some are different. As I say, one issue is, do you provide different types of analysis for different audiences, or do you provide one type that hits as many bits of the audience as you can? So for the forecast, we end up with a document that's 250 pages long. There's a lot of material included in this. Some of the audience are interested in all of it. That's a very small number of people are interested in all of it, probably about 5. There's some people in the Treasury, people at 2 or 3 think tanks, 2 or 3 very conscientious journalists. The IMF, the OECD will go through it all in detail. But for lots of other people come up to me afterwards and say, oh, yeah, the economy section's really useful, but you could shrink the rest of it. Or they say, oh, we love the stuff on public spending, but frankly, you could get rid of a lot of the stuff on tax. That's not. And then the other people say, we want even more on tax and less on that. What happens, of course, is that the report just gets longer and longer over time as you satisfy each of these audiences, and you can never take stuff away. So thinking about how to manage that over time is important. Some of the people who read your stuff or who listen to your stuff are regular consumers, so they get to know and understand the way you do the work. And they're particularly interested in how it's changed since the last time you asked the same question. That, I think, can be quite important in establishing independence, because if you said 6 months ago the outlook for the public finances looks dreadful, and then 6 months later you say the outlook for the public finances looks a lot better, then for some people, the question is, oh, so why have they got so much more optimistic now? Is that because they've been lent on by the ministers? Is that because something has changed? Is that because they've changed their judgments about these things? So you need to think about that as an important area of communication. On the other hand, there will be some audiences who don't care what you said 6 months ago, but just want a relatively simple, straightforward guide to what the public finances are going to do over the next 5 years. So again, those are 2 different audiences, and if you can, producing something that's tailored to each of them is a good idea. The approach we've taken in the main forecast document we produce is that, as I say, it's 250 pages long, but we have a 2-page overview, which is for the people who really just want the basics, and a 20-page summary, which goes through chapter by chapter, and then there's the document itself. We have a non-technical guide as well, but we don't have enough time before the budget is completed to produce that, so that comes out a couple of weeks afterwards, and it's more tailored towards an audience of students or university teachers or those sorts of people. And as I say, the danger really with this is it just tends to grow over time. One thing you can do to deal with that is to although we are required to produce the book and present it to Parliament, is that you can have annexes of that or sets of tables that you can keep those on the website, which keeps the main document slim. So that's one way of trying to stop the thing just getting completely out of hand. When we're writing the publication, as I say, we try to write with the various audiences that we expect to read it in mind. And it's important you're writing for the audiences, not for the people who gave you the information that goes into the report. There is a temptation, as for journalists, as I used to be as a journalist, as the chairman said, it's called writing for your sources. You write something that's going to look smart to the official or the politician who told you the piece of information in the first place, and not actually for the people who need to know it and understand it. And so its focus on the audience is key. Partly because of my background, when I'm writing the 2-page overview, I do think of it as writing a newspaper story. And the mental discipline of saying, well, if I was writing this on the front page of the national paper or wherever it might be, how would you be telling this story? How would you make sure you get the main points up at the top? How would you order this in order for it to be as useful as possible? And that's a useful discipline. What are the key messages you want to get out of this? If you were stuck in a lift or in an elevator for 35 seconds and somebody said, so I've seen your report, what should I get out of this? It's good to know what your answer to that 35-second question would be, because it's told you what the first paragraph of your report ought to be, if that's going to basically tell people what the messages are. Is there a single, are there key phrases which will, be useful in drumming home the message? Is there a particular graph or a particular picture that will tell the story? I think we've heard a bit of this already. Obviously, avoiding jargon and acronyms is a good idea. We try, occasionally we have resource departmental expenditure limits, appears in a draft document. That has to go out and it's replaced by day-to-day spending on public services. Try to get the acronyms out. The acronyms also tend to sneak into the graphs as well. So get rid of total managed expenditure and replace it by total spending. Those sorts of relatively simple things. I think another key issue for us and for building trust is to write with humility. Admit to the uncertainty around the estimates that you may have made about the impact of particular policies or about the outlook in the future. I think that's a desirable thing in its own right. It's being intellectually honest. It's also a good guide for parliamentarians and policymakers, because they need to know that things are never going to turn out exactly as you have forecast or predicted, and policy should be decided on the basis of the range of possible outcomes, not just your best guess of where it's most likely to be. And also, out of self-interest, for those of you who are doing this exercise, it gets your defense in early when it turns out to be wrong in 6 months' time. You can go back and say, oh, well, I told you 6 months ago that there was a lot of uncertainty around this, and that's only to be expected that the number was twice as big or half the size as we told it was going to be 6 months ago. So honesty can also be in your own self-interest. As I say, I think images and charts, of which I would have shown you some examples, can be quite useful. When you're preparing them, think about the message you're trying to be telling, not about, I've got a lot of data, let's see how much of this I can stick onto one picture. You are like a short, crisp sentence trying to send a particular message. Make the underlying data available. So people might want to repeat it or see exactly what the numbers were. So again, this is something you can bury away on the website as a spreadsheet. So if people want to see, well, exactly how does this graph work, then they can go back and find it for themselves with some help. Show plenty of history when you can. I think often the graphs that people most like and are most enlightened by are ones where you put recent developments or your future forecasts in a relatively long historical context, because then they can see how important that is. Using graphs as a simple summaries. So we have the government in the UK has 4 fiscal targets. So when the budget comes out on the homepage of our website, we have 4 boxes with a green tick if they're hitting it and a red cross if they're not. That's just a very simple way to drum it home. They're hitting 3 targets out of 4 would have been the message you would have got last time we did this. Another way that others have used is traffic lights. So red, orange, and green, is this something to be very worried about? It's okay, or this is fine. That can be a useful tool as well. Graphs can be helpful, and images can be helpful in illustrating uncertainty. Show your latest forecast alongside the previous ones, and people can see how much confidence they should have in it. They can be useful for demonstrating international comparisons. So relatively simple ways. If you say the budget deficit has gone up, well, yes, but is that big? Do we need to worry about this? Putting that into international context. So for us, a graph that compares it with every other OECD country. You don't need to say what all those countries are, but if we're towards the top of the league table or towards the bottom of the league table, that's all the message you really need to get across. A few sort of random thoughts at the end. One of which it was useful advice when I first started writing newspaper editorials, was the editor of the paper I worked for at the time said that the reader ought to look at the 400 words you've written and think it's an iceberg. That beneath, they can see what's on the waterline, but they know that there's a huge submerged mass of knowledge and understanding beneath the water. And I think so, whatever you're producing, the fact that people know and you can communicate as best you can, that there is much more detail and understanding here, which they can ask about if they want to, but you're not going to bother them with them, you know, as a relatively short message is a useful thing to start. I think one has to face up to the simplicity and completeness challenge. On the one hand, you think, let's write as much about this as we can because that's being as transparent as possible, but the more you put out, the less chance there is of everybody reading it. So you have this trade-off between, you know, keeping it simple, making it complete. And of course, the irony is that writing something short is often takes longer than writing something long because you have to condense it and think about it and distill it rather than just writing out everything that you first thought of. Think about when you're misrepresented or criticized. Obviously, in communication terms, you can respond publicly every time that happens, or only rarely. And I think there's a difficult choice to be made. We tend to respond relatively rarely, but then people notice when we do. So the Prime Minister 2 or 3 years ago made a speech in which, I think this was just inadvertent, he got it wrong rather than deliberate, said that we had said that the budget didn't affect economic growth. I had to write a letter publicly to him saying, oh yes it did, and it was the lead item on the television news that night. If you write those sort of letters every day, everybody tosses them straight in the bin and nobody takes any notice. So pick your battles. Make use of non-experts. If you've got people who don't, know the full detail of the material, that your particular piece of material you're producing, they're the ideal person to read it because they can tell you if you're understanding it or not. And then finally, I would say, think very carefully about managing relationships well. In the UK context, and because we have quite a lot of interaction with the Treasury and with ministers, it may be different here, but in the UK, politicians deal a lot better with bad news than they do with surprises. If there's something nasty you need to communicate, if you do it in a predictable way that explains why you've done it and you don't suddenly spring them on it and make them look, awkward in public, then that's generally fine. Whereas even if you give them good news and it comes as a surprise, it can be quite a challenge. So think about managing those relationships, about communicating before you go public with something. It makes everybody's life a bit easier. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Choate, for sharing this valuable input. Of course, from established democracy and a larger economy from the UK, thanks very much. Also, at this stage, I will not allow us for discussions on the input by Mr. Choate because we have been joined by the National Chair of the National Council of Provinces, Honorable Thandi Modise, on my right here, Mr. Choate. And Madam Chair, Mr. Choate was just presenting on the last item of the two-day conference. Of course, tomorrow the day will be at the visits outside the normal historical and heritage sites in South Africa. So we honored, Chair, that you join us. It was the last day, and in search of the best international practice model on parliamentary budget oversight. So, Mr. Choate, you will come back. I'm going to move away here as well, so that the seating arrangement in Parliament is quite clear. So it does explain authority. So the chairperson will come and sit where she's supposed to be. Just as a welcoming note, our chairperson, Meta Ndimudise, is a long-standing member of the ANC, which is the governing party in South Africa. He served under very difficult conditions of struggle during the time when this organization was banned and they have to find a way outside the country to join the military wing of the ANC, Umkhonto weSizwe, and contributed immensely in the struggle for liberation, and also helped to dispel the myths about the role and contribution of women in the struggle for liberation. So she's also amongst the pathfinders of our democratic dispensation. In 1994, to date, has served under different capacities, first as a member of parliament and as a chair of the portfolio committee or joint committee on defense in parliament, and also serve as a speaker of the province and serve as a premier or governor. In other countries, you say governors, meaning at the forefront of the implementation of the Reconstruction and Development Program. And now is a national chair of the Council of Provinces to ensure that Parliament in South Africa plays a critical role in deepening democracy. Deepening democracy to us means also translating into the material gains or changing conditions of life of the people. So, Madam Chair, most welcome to address us.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be asked once more to come and to say a few words at your closing session. It's important because the network of parliamentary budget offices become one of the weapons, and I use the word very, very advisedly, one of the weapons which especially poor economies, developing and underdeveloped economies in Africa can use. We can use it to ensure that parliaments begin to do what they are supposed to do. We can use it to ensure that parliaments get from under the shadows of the executive and actually begin to do what the electorate vote for us to come and do in parliaments. We can use it to analyze, to predict. I think Professor Jahed once told me he can actually predict whether a budget is worth its salt in 10 years from now, looking at the figures and looking at the plans that stand before you. But we can also measure the maturity of any growing democracy with its willingness to put aside capacity to create the budget offices. There are too few budget offices in African parliaments. And where they are, must have been 2 weeks ago when we met in Abuja as presiding officers in the CPA. Where we do have parliamentary budget offices, they seem to have exactly the same problems. The challenges of capacity, resourcing, the challenges of reporting lines, and that is not to be taken lightly, because the establishment of the parliamentary budgeting offices begin to give voice to committees which might not otherwise be able to understand budgets, be able to interrogate the executives to the levels that we should be doing as Parliament. And if you are in a situation like South Africa, Westminster type, you really need to empower even greater your parliamentarians, because the situation doesn't give you enough muscle as Parliament to do what you should do. So what you need to do is pour resources into these budget offices, make sure that you can cover all your committees, make sure that they can go beyond just preparing and capacitating in a very small way, which is where I think we still are. We don't think we have reached the capacity of our parliamentary budget office yet as South Africa. We think that we should still do a little bit more. So you're coming together this week, over these 2 days, to share experiences, can but only add to the little that we as this Parliament is gaining. So I want to say to you, thank you very much for coming to South Africa. I hope we have not treated you too badly. I hope that the weather has been able to shine on you. And I know the weather in Cape Town can be very unfriendly sometimes. But I hope that you are able to see some sights, I'm told tomorrow, because it is not just about wielding the big stick. It is also about ensuring that parliamentarians across the world, across Africa, begin to know one another, to network, share experiences. I would want to say to Professor Jahed and your team, thank you very much for representing us well. I take it that you have done your best. If he has not done his best, I will get a whisper and we will deal with it somewhere. But he is usually on top of his game, so I want to say thank you for doing everything that you can. I want to thank the members of parliaments. It's not always an easy thing to take time away, especially when you are chairpersons, and I can see some chairpersons sitting here, from your specific committees to come into a information sharing program like this one. I'd also want to say that our job is not done. Our job as the continent of Africa is just beginning. Our voices have not yet reached where we should. And perhaps next year, Prof, wherever you will be, we will see a little better representation of women amongst yourselves, gentlemen in the budget offices, better than we see today. Because if we want to talk about democratization, about representativity, we'd better not just be looking at the geography. We want to see the gender. All genders, by the way, not just the two. We want to see voices which are not heard, but we also want to hear analysis which we do not look at. I can tell you that when Professor Jahed was briefing us, MEPOSA, on the NDP, we realized that unless Parliament wakens up, we're not actually going to reach the targets of the NDP. And that says a lot about the state of capacity within Parliament to ask the right questions. It says quite a lot about the determination of especially the ANC MPs in Parliament about utilizing the powers that you have in your committees to do what is right. We fought for many years, says Sheila, to ensure that Parliament can begin to tinker and actually amend the budget. I have yet to hear of a committee in this Parliament saying, this is the direction we are recommending. Now, until Parliament uses its power, that power will be undermined as it is undermined. So I think parliaments tend to, we are very good in the public platforms to say we wield the powers of the purse. But we're not wielding the powers of the purse when we sit on the powers that that we have. So I would say, please network, please share experiences, but please remember that you are an instrument that is supposed to enable our parliaments to really begin to represent. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, for the words of wisdom, for reaffirming the role and place of parliamentary budgets in our parliaments and the critical role that parliaments plays. And it was indicated earlier that Madam Chair will not stay with us longer because of other engagements, but thanks the most for really coming to give these closing remarks to this important forum. Mr. Chode, I'm going to invite you back again. We're doing quite well together here. So come back to the session for, and there are very valuable issues that has been shared with us here by Mr. Chode earlier. He raised quite useful areas. So I think, can we really just have an indication? I see there's a hand, second hand, third hand. Yes, and there are 4 hands of members who, okay. Fifth, can we, is there anyone who will want to say something? Okay, 6. I'm counting hands. My role is a simple one now. 7, 8. Okay. Now, Prof. Jahed, I think I want to put it to you now that we have got 9 hands who wants to say something. And I really want to present my apology that at this stage I'll request one of the chairs, Mayor Posa, to proceed with this session because I'm going to be under very serious problem. We are at the tip end of South Africa here, or Africa as a whole, Cape Town. I'm from a small province. It may sound rural, but it's very important in the history of the world. It's a political heritage of South Africa. So I have to travel by air going to that province. So I'll have limitation because there's only one flight there. And then just before, as a parting shot, I just want to thank that since yesterday, there's been valuable lessons that has been learned. And really, the fact that we having this dialogue and sharing experiences forms a very important basis for us, even if we may move from different experiences, strength of economies, diversity, and so forth. But clearly that this is important among us. So critical amongst key stakeholders is really to continue to mobilize partnerships and collaboration, research, NGOs and academic institutions to begin to define a new role of parliaments in a democratic society. So thanks very much for these views. I would like to call you co-chair so that you conclude this session. Yes, those questions that must be raised, I think, so that they are appropriately handled. Thanks.
Well, honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, there are 9 hands that were identified or recognized. So we'll go straight to number 1. Yes, please.
Robert, thank you for the presentation. Very often politicians like to ask questions with their needs in mind and may not do this in public briefings. What if any, role do you place or have for private briefings with individual members or committee members in private? And if you do engage in those briefings, who does them in your office and how, and what risk do these carry, in your opinion?
Yes, thank you for the question. We are happy to talk to individual parliamentarians on a confidential basis. What I always tell them is that we will, as I mentioned earlier, we routinely publish on our website a log of when we meet, for example, with the finance minister or his senior officials, things like that. So if I was to meet with the opposition treasury spokesperson, for example, I will tell them that I'm going to put on the website that we have met normally, quote unquote, to discuss the role of the OBR. There may be more particular questions. So you want to be transparent about it at that level. What I am slightly wary of it is when you occasionally get an invitation to have a meeting and the only purpose of the meeting is for the member to then announce publicly, I have just met with the OBR and said that it's terribly important to do X or Y. And sometimes I read in the newspapers that we've had a letter, that the OBR has been asked to do this, and the letter has never turned up. But, there can be that publicity element occasionally, and you need to be a bit careful about it. But, I think it's absolutely right that you should take the time to explain to people what you're doing and how you're doing it. And generally speaking, doing that in a private way, obviously I wouldn't reveal if they wanted to tell me particular policy ideas that they were thinking of. You would, respect those confidences. So, yes, it's a good idea, but be careful.
Thank you. There's a hand.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair. With due respect, I just would like to make a proposal that we get all the questions and note them in the interest of time, that to get all the questions and then we get the responses. It can save quite a bit of time.
Okay, there's an alternative method of work that has been proposed. Are we all in agreement? All right. Let's take all the questions. And then Mr. Choku.
Choku, yes. I'll answer the easy ones.
Yes. All right. Shall we then have number 2? And if number 2, if you could be short and to the point.
Hello. Yes. My question actually is still on the involvement of a civil society organization. So when we are presenting, I was just asking myself, what ideally is PBO sufficient in terms of capacity? Is there any way that civil society might also partner with the PBOs so that maybe to give a certain capacity to help the parliamentarians if that is there? And also, you mentioned on the issues of dissemination of information of a PBO. I'm asking if it is possible also to use some of the civil society forums that are existing within the country so that actually to also, the partnership between the PBO and the civil society to advocate for whatever they are saying, if it is, yeah.
Yes, my question is actually very related to that, but it's more about how will parliamentarians see, or the executive see, if the PBO is directly getting engaged with media and civil society. It's different in different countries, but it feels like the PBO needs to first get vetted or approval from the clerk or parliament to then go present something to the media or to work together with civil society? How maybe different experiences in the room?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions. Mr. Choate, the OBR, you said, if I remember correctly, was established in 2010. What did the House of Commons do before that? Was there any kind of body in existence before that? And how did that operate as compared with the OBR? And then secondly, Mr. Khan yesterday told us that PBOs or OBRs, whatever you want to refer to them as, basically protect us from Magna Carta rights or protect the Magna Carta rights. To me, that means either undue punishments for things you may or may not have done, or undue taxes. I'd like your comments on that. Are we being protected from undue taxation by PBOs and OBRs? Thank you.
Much. Number 5. Number 6. Number 7.
Thank you. Mine is more of a general comment, probably that would go to the organizers more than the presenter. I think over the last 2 days we've listened to the deliberations and appreciate the role of PBOs in national parliament. However, my recommendation is that as you move forward and since you're still at the formative stage, please bring on board regional parliaments and continental parliaments so that then we can all work together, especially like I had when we were talking about mainstreaming of continental policies into national budgets. Then we all then are able to be on the same wavelength as we move forward. Thank you.
Number 8. The last one, number 9.
Thank you. That's me, number 9. I was waiting for that number to come. Thank you, sir, for your presentation. It was quite interesting. I think one of the things. Thank you for the input. I think that's why we're trying to get the network. Try to see how we can involve the regional and the continent as well. Thank you so much. We'll take it forward. Mr. Choate, I think what's always been the discussion, we've got new offices, some aspiring to become offices. What always becomes important is the quality of the work and the information that we put out there becomes quite important. I just want you to comment, how do you ensure the quality of your work and credibility and all of that when you put it out there? I think it's very important. Because I mean, also that you advise members of parliament which are not experts in the field. Sometimes you try to make sure that you don't lead them in a wrong way. Thanks.
I will now hand over to Mr. Choate to respond.
Thank you very much indeed. That was a very good selection of questions. On the civil society one, yes, I think there's clearly a useful opportunity for sharing of information in particular. There are obviously civil society covers an awfully large range of potential organizations. Some will have very useful information that can supplement that which you would get from government agencies and come with that, and it's very important to be able to draw on that. I think in terms of saying that you're going to have partnership with organizations, again, it depends very much on what those are, because you do have to protect the independence of the institution, and a lot of civil society institutions will have particular policy objectives that they're promoting. Those may be entirely sensible and desirable ones, but you don't want the office to become too much of a player in political or policy debates where that would undermine its independence and the trust that people would place in the rest of its work. So that would be my only caveat there. Certainly one thing which can be very useful is using the networks that civil society organizations have of the press and other people that they engage with, so going and speaking at their meetings without any prejudice to saying you're supporting them or agreeing them can be very useful, because it gets you a wider audience and it's helpful for them as well to know what you're thinking and doing. Do governments mind if you engage with, or parliaments mind if you engage with the media directly? As that question implies, I think this depends very much on the rules of the game in the particular country. we are not, we are jointly accountable to the executive and to Parliament. We are not a strictly parliamentary body. And in a sense, you know, one is a protection against the other, and we have both of those roles. So no one can stop us going out and talking to the press or to anybody else, and indeed the legislation gives us that right. But I think the responsibility that comes with that is, you know, you don't go out and shoot your mouth off on every policy issue that you might have a view on. You only go out and talk about those things that you've got a good detailed piece of work that you can refer people back to. So little and, you know, again, choosing the moments when it's appropriate to go out and talk rather than just being out there constantly, in which case you're more likely to be regarded as just getting involved into political debates or picking sides. So, you know, restrict it to when you've got some analysis and you need to go out there and explain it rather than being a sort of general talking head available for interviews. The question on what preceded the OBR, basically, the finance minister was required by legislation to produce forecasts every 5 years ahead, twice a year. They were actually always quite ambivalent about this for many years because, on the one hand, ministers don't like producing forecasts because forecasts are always wrong and then they look silly a bit later. But on the other hand, they're obsessed with the forecasts showing that the policies are working or that they're going to work. So all finance ministers have for decades been conflicted about whether they want that role. The closest we got to independent scrutiny was in the 1990s. The then finance minister asked the National Audit Office to say whether particular assumptions that went into the forecast, for example, the oil price, or, you know, how much VAT would be lost to tax avoidance, that the assumptions that were being made by the Treasury were reasonable or not. Now, the NAO actually never wanted that job. It pulled them into looking as though they were endorsing the whole forecast when that wasn't what they were being asked to do. So it was a difficult situation, and this, I think, is a much cleaner way of doing it. And the unusual thing in the UK compared to most countries is that we produce forecasts and the government doesn't. So we're not commenting on the government's numbers. We produce the numbers and the government has to decide whether to accept them or not as the basis for its policy work. Are we protected from undue taxation, etc.? Well, all I would say there is that, you know, we have, as I say, we are forbidden from giving policy advice. So we can't say it's too high, it's too low. And we're also focused on the health of the public finances in terms of how much borrowing, how much debt is accumulated. But it's not part of our job to say whether we should be a high-taxing, high-spending economy or a low-taxing, low-spending economy. Our job is to say if you're a high-spending, low-taxing economy, you're probably going to get into difficulties. So that's basically that. How do you ensure quality and credibility? Setting up good internal processes for who actually finally signs off the work is key. One thing which we've also found useful is to have an external advisory panel which consists of academics, some public and private sector people as well, who we don't ask about the details of individual forecasts, but we can ask them about some of the broad methodological questions, or if there's a, you know, what should we do about, you know, projecting the oil price. So big questions like that, that can be a useful source of quality assurance, but obviously it would be inappropriate for them to be sharing the details of the forecast themselves. That's it. I think that was it.
Thank you. Are there follow-up questions? Yes, Honourable Member Shopestole.
Sorry, Chair, I had to go out a little bit. I was quite impressed when you actually mentioned the word transparency, because now it came to my mind that maybe that is why there is Brexit from Europe, because I read something written by the former Greek minister, Yanis Varoufakis, and he was complaining a lot about the lack of transparency in the EU. And when you you insisted on transparency, so because I couldn't figure out why you wanted to leave the EU. So that is my assumption, well, that maybe you believe in transparency. But you know, in February this year, we went on a study tour to Germany, and we had a meeting with the budget office. And we were trying to find out how transparent they were in our own rural understanding, you know, because we believe in South Africa that, you know, during the budget, you must talk to the citizenry. But you talked about the website. So I assumed that it's because everybody in the UK is able to look at the website. You know, if it was in my country, it would not be enough because it's only a few rich and elite who don't even make 1% of our population who can actually access a website. So I am actually wanting your explanation on whether there are things like public participation, the ordinary men and women being addressed on financial issues, or it is limited to the website. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that. On the transparency issue, one issue on which we do remain neutral, professionally speaking, is on Brexit. So I can't say whether I'm in favour of that or against it. Obviously, we have to produce forecasts that incorporate the potential impact of it. And there are different reasons of the people who are in favour of it. There are different people who have different reasons for being in favour of it. Certainly, from our point of view, I think that the biggest contribution we can make is increasing transparency around the data and around the analysis. We need to be very clear to people, and I say this having spent 10 years as a journalist being rude about the economic forecasts that the finance ministry or the central bank produced, is that I cannot promise to deliver perfectly correct answers about what's going to happen in the future. What I can do is promise to give an honest answer based on professional judgment and not on a political wishful thinking. And transparency is basically the way you try to persuade people that whether they agree with what you say or not, these are the reasons why you have said it, and these are the data, this is the analysis, this is the approach that you've taken that leads you to that conclusion. And that I think, is the biggest difference that we can make. In terms of the channels, you're absolutely right. The notion of communicating with the general public, you know, the vast majority of the general public have got other more important things to worry about than our forecasts. The website is basically a way for example, the media, civil society organizations, educational institutions to be able to get relatively easy access to the information without having to go down to a library and get the books out. Some members of the general public will engage directly in that sort of way, but you're absolutely right that would be a very limited number. I suspect that the vast majority of members of the general public who are conscious of things that we've said or that we have forecast, that's come via reading what they've heard in the media or watched it on television. So it's a second-hand argument there. On the issue of public participation more broadly, and in a sense that's perhaps more a question for the process of policy formation. We're not about policy formation, we're about producing analysis that is useful for other people when they're doing that. And I think it would be fair to say that the UK has relatively little formalised public participation in the budget process relative to most other countries. We try to be very transparent about the analysis we've produced that comes out at the time of the budget and people can see what it was based on. We do go and engage with, go and talk at schools and universities and other bodies like that are interested in it. but for the vast majority, I suspect, of quote unquote the general public, it's via the media that they get the material, and it's keeping them well informed and helping them to understand what's going on is our best channel to do that.
Yes. Looks like we have now exhausted the questions. Or there's another follow-up. Let me then rule as the chairperson that this will be the last follow-up so that we can make progress. I can see you are tired. Though, you know, you were really attentive, but at least we must also be reasonable, you know. Okay, okay, ma'am, you may come in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for allowing me. I heard that you are associated with the Times. Is it the Times?
Financial Times.
The Financial Times. You know, we were, in 2014, we were doing a certificate course on political economy with the University of Cape Town, and we're under Professor Ben Churok. I remember him telling us that in England, the newspapers associate themselves with a political party and they are open about it. They're not like here where people say, we're neutral, whereas they support another party. But in England, they say we support the Tories, or they say they support the Labour. Which one do you support?
May I rule, may we not go political? And let's just rise above and focus on the business of this conference. Because I'm afraid, once you start declaring, a lot of you will want to declare as well. And I'm not sure if I'll be able to control that one. No. So please, may I request you not to respond on this one? Okay, thank you very much. I'm being fair. Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Protected, yeah. Okay, honorable members, we have been sitting in this meeting for 2 days as delegates from different countries. And indeed, the theme of the conference is the role of PBOs in African Parliament's fiscal oversight, contribution to the African development agenda. And we received presentations that had relevance with the theme of the conference. And you will agree with me that we're going back home richer because of those presentations. And not only the presentations, also the vigorous engagement between ourselves. And in addition, as we were engaging, we also made recommendations, certain recommendations. Now, I wouldn't want those recommendations to just get lost. I'm not going to leave Professor Jahid off the hook with regard to what are we going to do with those recommendations, how are they going to be processed, because so that we don't lose them. Remember, we're here, we're working hard. So this is the wisdom that came from our, as I put it, vigorous engagement. So what are we going to do with those recommendations? And yes, indeed, if we don't have a declaration of this conference, in future, at the end of the conference, that's standard practice. We must come up with a declaration of the conference on the matters that we strongly feel we need to commit ourselves to. So they come in the form of a declaration. So if we don't have now, but in future, let's hope we will have a declaration, a conference declaration on those issues. So if only you can just All right. And honorable members and ladies and gentlemen, there are evaluation forms that were circulated. Indeed, as this front table will be happy to have those evaluation forms back, because we would like to identify improvement areas through your inputs, so that come the next conference, we then take it to another level by closing those gaps that maybe you will identify, and then we take this conference and this forum to greater heights. All right, I have already reminded the, are you able to respond on what we're going to do with the recommendations that came up in our engagement, Prof? And then from there, there's another announcement. There are two announcements, and then we close.
Thank you, Chair, colleagues. I think there was a numerous amount of recommendations that was coming out from the conference over the last 2 days. And they range from not only the study that Honorable Shope Setoli suggested on monopoly capital, but looking at other areas as well, like Mr. Choate has spoken about in terms of information and how we put it out there, the quality control. I think it was an excellent presentation as well in that regard. I also think the last comment made by my sister over there with respect to regional economic communities and parliamentarians are critical as well. So it probably will be the next phase where we move this up to include our politicians as well in this whole process as we build PBOs. There was also recommendations in the ANPBO meeting, Honourable Chair, with respect to formalizing our network, where we said that we would form a secretariat. We have a task team established already in terms of the secretariat, and we'll try and push that going forward as well, looking at how we could pull in the partners that are around this room to support us in that regard. The other areas, of course, also, and I think here the expertise of Mr. Choate and my other colleagues around the table in this room, is how we share the information amongst ourselves. And maybe we could apply our minds to that, whether it be through websites or other areas, Honourable Shope. But I think there's a lot of information that we can gather here and share with ourselves in terms of how we build our capacities and our PBOs in that regard. I think, of course, the last area is we will have another conference next year. And in this regard, I think what we've agreed on is that most of us PBOs sitting in this room will work on the program together, Honourable Chair, so that we enhance it, we enrich it. We also work on the days, how we're going to set it out, including the fact that we will include politicians in the next conference to take it up to the next level. So I think we've laid the basis, Honourable Chair, in terms of where we move to in the next conference of African PBOs, and how we'd like to structure it going forward in that sense. So what we will do is there will be a conference report that will be prepared like we did last year, Dr. Yankees, I think, and that will be circulated as a draft with everyone's inputs so that we come back with a final draft which will be available to everyone, which includes the recommendations and how we take the process forward next time, Chair. So in that sense, we have a declaration which will be taken forward. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. You will see that it was necessary that I asked him to speak on those recommendations. And thank you. Can see everybody's happy. Thank you so much, Professor Chahet. And then there is an announcement from AWEPA. Is the AWEPA delegate in here?
It was texted to me. Let me just... Okay. This concerns the team that is under the guidance of AWEPA. There are two shuttles. You know we have an evening meeting together, get together. So there are two shuttles that will be leaving the Southern Sun Hotel. The first shuttle leaves at 5 p.m. and then the next shuttle will be leaving at 6 p.m. So Sipatise and Kuzai will meet us at the hotel for the 6 p.m. shuttle, the last one. The meeting is at 6:30 at Table Hotel, at Camisa, is it Brasserie restaurant? I don't know the place, but you'll find it out. Camisa Brasserie. The good thing is we are likely to be going together, and Carly will be at the drop-off point to meet us. So for those who are staying in other hotels, you can make sure you are at the Southern Sun by 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. Or if you know the Table Bay Hotel, you can go there straight and we find you there. Thank you so much. That's all.
All right. I have not thanked Mr. Choate for his responses. Thank you so much for the invaluable information that you shared with us. And also, coming all the way, all of you as delegates, coming all the way to converge here. And I'm sure you have no regrets. No regrets, am I right? Except for the cold
Chair.
weather. Don't worry, next time we'll order a better weather for you when you come. Okay, and then thank you, sir. Thank you so much, all right? Then the coffee and cakes will be served outside as you walk out of this meeting. Indeed, it was a pleasure working with all of you, and I'm sure we have exchanged cards. Remember, it's about networking, and it works only through exchange of cards, and then you take it from there. Thank you so much. The meeting stands adjourned. Indeed, you were a very good audience. Thanks. Pleasure. I hope to see you again.
Yes.
This world is round. We'll